Off the coast of Norway, on the morning of the 8th of April, 1940, a single British destroyer was running out of sea room. HMS Glowworm, a G-class destroyer displacing roughly 1,350 tons, had already lost a man overboard in heavy weather and had fallen behind the main force she was escorting. She was alone, her captain had reported her position, and the Admiralty knew there was very little anyone could do for her. The men who had designed naval operations on paper would have called her situation straightforwardly hopeless. She was one destroyer in deteriorating weather, without support, in waters that were about to become one of the most contested stretches of ocean in the entire war. Some of her own company understood the arithmetic as well as any staff officer. What they encountered next was the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, a warship of nearly 14,000 tons, armed with 8-inch guns, and escorted by destroyers of her own. The disparity was not marginal. It was categorical. And yet, in the space of a single morning engagement, HMS Glowworm did something that still demands explanation 8 decades later. In a matter of minutes, she changed what it meant to be outmatched. This is how. To understand why the action off Norway on the 8th of April, 1940 matters, it is necessary to understand what both sides were actually doing in those waters that morning. Germany's invasion of Norway, Operation Wilfred, was among the most audacious naval gambles of the Second World War. The main strategic prize was the port of Narvik, through which Swedish iron ore flowed to German steel foundries. Without that ore, German war production faced serious constraint. Narvik was not merely valuable, it was, from Berlin's perspective, essential. Gross Admiral Erik Raeder had argued repeatedly that Norwegian ports would be of crucial importance for Germany in any prolonged war with Britain. Control of the Norwegian coastline would allow German surface ships and submarines to break out into the Atlantic past the British blockade line. It would open gaps that the Royal Navy could not easily close. The British understood this calculation. Operation Wilfred, the plan to mine Norwegian coastal waters, had been set in motion. HMS Renown had departed Scapa Flow on the 4th of April with 12 destroyers, Glowworm among them. The mission was to deny Germany the sheltered coastal route, the so-called leads, along which all shipments travelled in safety. What British planners had not fully anticipated was that German invasion forces were already at sea, moving simultaneously and with considerable strength. On paper, the Admiral Hipper made everything about Glowworm's situation worse. The Hipper was a heavy cruiser of the Admiral Hipper class, launched in 1937 and displacing nearly 10 times what Glowworm could claim. Her main armament consisted of 8-inch guns capable of engaging targets at ranges where Glowworm's own weapons were simply irrelevant. She carried armor plate designed to absorb punishment that would tear a destroyer apart on first contact. Her speed was not dramatically inferior to a destroyer's, which meant Glowworm could not simply run. On paper, her guns were heavier, her armor was thicker, her range was greater, and her crew was larger by an order of magnitude. On paper, the correct British response to encountering the Hipper was to disengage, report by wireless, and survive to fight another day. Every calculation of tonnage, firepower, and protection pointed toward the same conclusion, that HMS Glowworm was already doomed. But naval engagements are not decided on paper. What the ledger of comparative tonnage cannot capture is what HMS Glowworm actually was, and more precisely, what her commanding officer chose to make of the situation. By the time the two ships sighted one another on the morning of the 8th of April, 1940, Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope had already made a series of decisions that placed his destroyer in harm's way rather than clear of it. He had encountered German destroyers escorting the Hipper earlier in the engagement. He had exchanged fire with them. He had reported his contact by wireless to the Admiralty. He had done what the Navy required of him in terms of intelligence, and then he had kept his ship in the fight rather than withdrawing while he still could. The G-class destroyers to which Glowworm belonged were not the Navy's newest hulls in April 1940. Glowworm herself had been launched on the 22nd of July, 1935 at the William Denny shipyard in Dumbarton, a yard with a long history of building capable warships, but one that could not change the fundamental mathematics of a destroyer meeting a heavy cruiser. The G-class displaced around 1,350 tons standard. The Hipper displaced close to 14,000. Glowworm carried for 4.7-inch guns as her main battery. The Hipper carried 8-inch guns in armored turrets. Glowworm's torpedoes were her most dangerous offensive weapon, but to use them she had to close the range, precisely the range at which the Hipper's secondary armament could reduce a destroyer to wreckage. And yet the Hipper's commanders had a problem, too. Heavy cruisers are built for a particular kind of war, sustained engagements at range, or the destruction of enemy light forces in orderly sequences. They are not built for close-quarters action with a ship whose captain has decided that survival is no longer the primary objective. Glowworm, having exchanged fire with German destroyers and taken damage, had laid smoke to complicate the Hipper's gunnery. Smoke was a tool the destroyer had. It cost nothing in terms of armament and everything in terms of time bought. Inside that smoke, the relative advantages of the Hipper's guns were temporarily suspended. Lieutenant Commander Roope understood that he would not win this action in any conventional sense. He had one weapon that the Hipper could not easily counter at close range: the ship herself. A destroyer, even a damaged one, is a vessel of considerable mass when moving at speed. Roope turned Glowworm toward the Hipper. If you find these accounts of small ships pressing against impossible odds to be worth your time, subscribing to this channel means you won't miss the next one. The Hipper's crew saw what was coming. There was enough time to alter course, to attempt to avoid the collision, but not enough to do so completely. Glowworm struck the Admiral Hipper along her starboard side. At approximately 0958 hours on the 8th of April, 1940, HMS Glowworm made contact with the Admiral Hipper. The German cruiser's 8-inch guns had already been punishing the destroyer at ranges where Roope's own armament was marginal at best. Glowworm had taken serious hits. She was on fire. Her ability to fight a conventional gunnery duel had been effectively ended. What she retained was speed and momentum. At around 1000 hours, having laid smoke and turned hard inside it, Glowworm closed the remaining distance at full speed. She struck the Hipper's starboard side with sufficient force to tear away approximately 40 meters of the cruiser's anti-torpedo bulge, the very armored blister designed to absorb torpedo detonations. The collision buckled Glowworm's bow catastrophically. The impact opened the Hipper's hull. It was not the kind of damage that sinks a heavy cruiser outright, but it was real, structural damage to one of the Kriegsmarine's most important surface units, inflicted by a vessel less than a tenth of her displacement. Glowworm did not survive the impact in any fighting sense. She was already on fire from gunfire received before the ram, and the collision completed the destruction that the Hipper's guns had begun. She sank shortly after 1000 hours. The Admiral Hipper recovered a number of survivors from the water. 38 men were pulled aboard the German cruiser. Lieutenant Commander Roope was among those initially rescued, but he did not survive. The casualty figures for Glowworm's company were severe. Of a complement that had gone into action that morning, more than 100 men were lost. The 38 survivors owed their lives in part to the decision of the Hipper's commanding officer to heave to and conduct a rescue in waters where Allied submarines might have been present, a risk the Germans accepted. The structural damage to Admiral Hipper required her to put into a Norwegian port for repairs, temporarily removing her from the operational order of battle at a moment when the Kriegsmarine needed every major surface unit it possessed. The action off Norway on the 8th of April, 1940 produced results that operated on two entirely different levels. Tactically, the result was unambiguous: HMS Glowworm was sunk, her commanding officer killed, and the majority of her company lost. A G-class destroyer had been destroyed by a heavy cruiser, which is precisely what the pre-engagement mathematics had predicted. The Hipper survived. But the strategic accounting was considerably more complicated. The damage Glowworm inflicted on Admiral Hipper was not cosmetic. It removed the cruiser from frontline operations at the outset of the Norwegian campaign, a campaign the Kriegsmarine was conducting at the very edge of its logistical capacity. Warships committed to Operation Wilfred were being asked to escort invasion forces into ports covered by the Royal Navy, and the loss of even temporary use of a heavy cruiser had operational consequences. The Norwegian campaign itself continued until the 10th of June, 1940, and while Germany ultimately occupied the entirety of the country, the naval losses sustained by the Kriegsmarine during those weeks, at Narvik and elsewhere, permanently weakened Germany's surface fleet. Glowworm's action was recognized in the most significant way the Navy could offer. Lieutenant Commander Gerard Broadmead Roope was awarded the Victoria Cross, the recommendation supported in part by the account provided by the commanding officer of the Admiral Hipper himself, a rare instance of an enemy commander's testimony contributing to a British gallantry citation. Roope received the award posthumously. It was the first Victoria Cross of the Second World War to be gazetted for a naval action. On the morning of the 8th of April, 1940, the assessors and strategists who had looked at the numbers were not wrong. A 1,350-ton destroyer had no business surviving an encounter with a 14,000-ton heavy cruiser, and she did not survive it. The men who called her position hopeless were reading the situation accurately, by every orthodox measure. What they could not account for, what no tonnage calculation has ever successfully measured, was the decision made inside that smoke, in those final minutes, to turn toward the thing that was going to kill her regardless. HMS Glowworm was doomed. She knew it. Her captain knew it. And she rammed the Admiral Hipper anyway. If you have watched to the end of this account, thank you, it is genuinely appreciated. If you would like to be here for the next ship story, please subscribe and turn on notifications so it reaches you when it goes up, and a like on the video helps the channel considerably. There are more of these stories to tell, more ships that the ledger said couldn't win, and did.